This is the final part, part 8 of renovating a vintage twin Tangye type model steam engine, and here I'm fixing the two plinths that support the engine to the main hardwood base. This time I'm using brass screws to hold it all together because previously the steel screws were very rusty. In this clip I'm using some emery cloth to key the cylinders ready for the painting. These are some 7BA nuts and some 5BA and 7BA studding. The 5BA studding will be used to fix the engine down onto the twin plinths. Do not under any circumstances use pliers to fit studding. The holes in the plinths are already threaded because they were holding the engine in the first place with the existing studding. But the original studding was a bit damaged, hence the idea of using some new stuff. I normally fit studs this way, using a pair of lock nuts and then use a socket to just screw them into place. On the first one, I'm just checking that it's the right length by offering the engine casting up against it, and yes, it looks okay. Once I get the length right for the first one, I just duplicate it on the rest. So once the stud is screwed into position, all you have to do is use a couple of small spanners to release the lock nuts, which will come off very easily. Once all the studs are fitted, it's time to fit the first of the engine castings. I'm using a soft hammer to just tap it firmly into place before tightening up all the nuts with a small spanner. Where it's possible to use a socket driver, I use a socket driver because it's much quicker, but there are certain places on models like here where a socket driver would mark the paint, but here the socket driver's okay. If you're doing a job like this, it's worth mentioning, do not over tighten the nuts that hold the bed plate to the actual plinth. This is the exhaust union being tightened, and in this clip I'm fitting the top bearing caps to the main bearings. Be very careful not to lose the nuts when you're doing this. I generally drop a few on the floor. Do not over tighten these nuts at all. The main bearings must not be a tight fit onto the crankshaft. The crankshaft must be very free to rotate with sufficient room for some oil in there. And if there's no room in there for any oil, then the engine's going to wear out very quickly and it may even seize up. Just nip up the bearing top caps and then ease the spanner back just a fraction. That way the wheel will turn very freely. The crankshaft doesn't want to be a rattle fit in the bearing, but with a bit of experience you'll figure out when it's right. And once you've done this, oil the bearings. Here I'm using some 3-in-1 machine oil, just to make sure I've got a good coating of oil on the main bearings. Right from the beginning of this rebuild, I have had a few reservations about the crankshaft on this engine. Not to mention the single bolt fixing for the crosshead to the piston rod. More about this shortly. Here I'm assembling one of the big ends. Another strange thing about this engine is that the crank pins are both a different diameter, which means you can't get the big ends mixed up, I suppose, but it's a little bit of a bizarre thing to do. Generally I work on slightly larger engines than this one, but what I find strange about this engine, no matter how big it is that it's a single 7BA pinch bolt onto the piston rod that holds the crosshead in position. Here I'm making a slight adjustment. What I did in the end was I re-threaded it and put a 6BA bolt in there. Slightly more substantial, but only slightly. A quick check to make sure nothing's binding, and yes, everything seems to be okay. So it's time to fit the valve gear. And one side of the valve gear also operates the water pump, which once again I think is not a good idea, but who am I to question this? Here it is together. What I did next was fit the cylinder end covers temporarily, fit the inlet manifold and put some compressed air in to see how it runs. And I'm really not thrilled with it. It sounds a little bit like a pneumatic drill, and I thought it was going to do this. All the problems with this engine are due to the crankshaft. I always like the steam engines that I work on to run very well, and run very well for a long period of time. I really cannot give this back to my friend and say, there you go, enjoy playing with it, because the first time you put any pressure on it, everything slips. 7BA bolts are just not enough to hold eccentric sheaves onto crankshafts. Plus the flywheel's not keyed properly onto the crankshaft either. So what I'm going to do is temporarily put this on one side and move on to another project, and I will revisit this. I'm going to completely make a new crankshaft and make it strong. Thanks for watching this short series, and I hope you found it useful.